Hello, in this lecture I will continue to talk about the rules of chess. First of all, I will start with the progress of the game. The player with the white tools is the first to play. Each player in turn moves one of the tools in his possession, only one tool, except in the case of the castling, where each tool has its except in the case of castling. In the case of castling, actually you move two tools at the same time in one move. If you do the small castling, you move the king and then the rook. The same thing is about the big castling. You move first of all the king two squares towards the rook, and then you move the rook before the king. So this is the only option to move two tools in one move. Okay. Each tool has its own unique way of moving, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, and so on until a decision is made. The player can move any piece in turn and move it wherever he wants, provided that it doesn't violate the rules of moving the pieces. Also, if a certain player's king is exposed to threat from an opponent's piece, a situation known as check, the player must do everything in his power to eliminate this situation. Yes, for example, in this position, the white king is threatened by check by the black bishop on d5, so the white must react to the check and eliminate immediately the threat of check. If he fails to eliminate the threat, he will lose the game, in a state known as a checkmate. Any move that doesn't result in this immediately will be illegal. So, in this position, if it is white's, of course it is white's position because the black threatens check on the white king, and if the white, for example, in this position moves his pawn from edge 2 to edge 4, this move is an illegal move. Why? Because the king is in a threat of check by the black bishop, so it is an illegal move. Okay, the white must eliminate the threat of check either by blocking the line of attack, like moving the pawn e2 to e4, or you can also move the king to a square that it is not threatened, like king to g3 or king to e3 or king to f4 or king to g4. Okay, in addition to this, any move that would immediately result in the player's king being in check is also illegal. The king is the only piece that must not deliberately placed under threat by another piece. Okay, so I will show you what I mean. In this position, if it is white's turn, then the white is not allowed to play king to g5. Why? Because the black bishop threatens, the black bishop on c8 threatens the king. The king is also not allowed to go to h3 from the same reason that the black bishop on c8 threatens the king. Also the king is not allowed to go to f3 because the bishop on d4 is threatens the king. So the king is not allowed to go to a square that he is threatened, that he will be threatened by the opponent's tool on the square that he moved. Okay, now I will explain the rules of beating. If one of the opponent's piece stands in the way of the moving piece, he can eat it, provided it is a legal move. So, in this position, the bishop, as I have already explained to you in the previous lecture, the bishop moves diagonally. So if in its way of moving diagonally there is an opponent's tool, it can eat that tool. The pawn g2 is in the way of the black bishop's moving. Okay, so the black can eat the white pawn. Unlike in checkers, for example, eating is a right and not an obligation. By eating another tool, it means removing it from the board and placing the eating tool in its place. Okay, as I've already showed you, in this position, the black bishop eats the white pawn, so we remove the white pawn from the board, and we place the black bishop on the previous place of the white pawn. Okay, that is the meaning of eating another tool. Eating your opponent's tool or piece. The king cannot be beaten. Okay. I have already explained you that thing that in a case of chess like this position, the white must eliminate immediately the threat of check, and not like any other tool that you can eat the tool. The king cannot be eaten. If the king is threatened in check and he has nowhere, the king has nowhere to go, then it will be checkmate. The king cannot be beaten. It is customary to declare in a situation where he is exposed to a threat and cannot be defended for checkmate. Some shorten it to mate. So I will show you a position of checkmate or mate. So this position is a checkmate position. Why? Because the black bishop on d5 threatens check on the white king, and the white has nowhere to go with his king. Every square that the white king will try to move, he will be threatened in that square. For example, he cannot go to g3 because in g3 he will be threatened by the pawn h4. He is not allowed to go to the square of g4 because in g4 he is threatened by the pawn f5. Why is threatened by the pawn f5? Because, as I have already told you, the pawn beats diagonally in the forward direction and he moves forward. So the king is not allowed to go to g5 because in g5 is threatened by the pawn f5, and he is not allowed to go to e3 because in e3 is threatened by the pawn d4, and he also is not allowed to go to the square e4 because in e4 is threatened by two pieces, by the pawn on f5 and by the black bishop on d5. So this position is a checkmate position. Actually, the black did a checkmate to the white king and won the game. So the black did a mate or checkmate to the white and won the game. All tools eat according to their movement. For example, the bishop will only eat on its diagonal. As I have already showed you, the bishop can eat the pawn on g2. Why? Because he moves diagonally, and g2 is a square in its way of moving. You can eat the pawn on g2. Also, in this position, if it is black's turn, the black rook on edge 8 can eat the pawn on edge 2, like this. Why? Because the rook moves straight, and if on its way of moving there is opponent's tool on one of its way of moving, then can eat that tool. Yes, can eat the tool by removing the tool from removing the pawn from the board and placing the rook in the place that the pawn was previously. Okay. The same thing is correct about the knight. The knight can go to g2, so if in g2 there is a piece on g2, then he can eat the opponent's piece on g2. Also, the black knight can go to the square e2, and if on e2 there is an opponent square, he can eat the piece of the opponent and place the knight on the square that where the opponent's tool. There was the opponent's tool. Also, same thing applies to the queen. The queen moves diagonally and also straight, so if on its way of moving there is an opponent's tool, it can eat the tool. So the queen moves diagonally, and there is a bishop on the diagonal that the queen can move, so the black queen can eat the white bishop, but it is not a good move, because then the white king will eat the black queen. But theoretically it is possible. Also, as I've already explained you, the queen also moves straight, so in its way of moving there is a pawn, so he can eat that pawn and place the queen instead of the pawn. The pawn is removed from the board. Okay, so usually a tool or a piece can eat according to the way of its moving. That is the general rule. But in that rule we have an exception. And the exception is the pawn. The pawn moves forward but eats diagonally. I've already showed you the way of the how the pawn is moved and how he eats, so I will repeat quickly. The pawn moves forward, and from the second row it can move 2 steps, but usually it can move forward only 1 step. If he is in the third row and this is the position and it is white's turn, it can move only 1 square forward. The same thing applies to the black side. If the black pawn is on the 7th row, it can move forward 2 squares. Okay. Yes, the option also to move only 1 square, but the pawn eats diagonally. So if, for example, this is the position and it is black's turn, then the black can eat the white's queen. The black can eat the white's queen by the pawn c5. Why? Because the pawn eats diagonally, so if there is a queen on the way of its eating, it can eat that tool. It can eat the queen, because the queen is in its way of eating. A special case of eating is the en passant rule. I showed you in the previous lesson what is en passant rule. I will repeat on that rule quickly, and then later I will explain in detail what that rule really means. So the en passant rule is in this position. If it is white's turn and he moves his pawn 2 squares forward, then the black has the right to eat the pawn that moved 2 squares forward, like this. Or if the white moves the pawn d2 2 squares forward, the black has the right to eat that tool like this. This is the ampersand rule. I will explain the rule in detail later. Okay? So now I will talk about the stages of the game. So actually, in the game of chess, we have 3 stages. The first stage is the opening stage. The second stage is the middle game. And the third stage is the end game. Okay, we will start with the first stage. This is the opening stage. At this stage, the player develops his tools, which are blocked behind the row of pawns. Yes, the tools are blocked behind the row of pawns. Yes, so the both sides develop their tools in order to allow them to control the center of the board and threaten the opponent's defense. The opening phase also includes the evacuation of one of the sides in order to allow the castling, which aims to fortify the king in a corner and keep him away from the exposed center. I have already explained you what is castling. I will explain later in detail when you allow to do castling. Okay? A typical opening usually involves a double jump with the king or queen's pawn. This is the king's pawn and this is the queen's pawn. So usually you open with the king's or queen's pawn like this. The black can do the same thing. Taking out one of the 2 knights. Yes, usually the white will move with his knight like that, and then the black will answer, and then the bishops. One of the 2 bishops. So the white can take out his bishop from f1 to c4, then the black can do the same thing, and then the white can castle, and then the black can take out his knight to f6. The white can open way to the bishop, and then the black can castle 2 small castling. Okay? There are openings called gambits, in which one of the sides sacrifice material, usually pawn, in order to take control of the center. So I will show you one example of gambit opening. The name of the opening is Queen's Gambit, accepted. When the white opens, it runs two squares with the queen's pawn, and then the black also does the same thing, and then actually the white sacrifices a pawn. Yes, why sacrifice it? Because he wants to gain control on the center of the board. So this opening is called Queen's Gambit, accepted. So if, for example, the white does c2 to c4, and the king and the black doesn't take the knight, the pawn on c4, but does this move, then the opening is called Queen's Gambit, but not accepted because the black didn't take the pawn. So the number of openings is large, and the number of their variants is even larger. Professional players memorize many openings in order not to make mistakes at the beginning of the game, which will give an early advantage to the opponent. So there is a lot of tactics in the middle game that I will not talk about them in this lecture. And now I'll talk about the first stage of the game. The first stage is the end game, and this stage happens when a large number of tools exchanges have been made without a decisive advantage. So in the third stage of the game, the end game, there is few tools left on the board. This stage usually includes a small number of pieces for each side. For example, king and bishop against king and the rook. Okay, or king and pawn against king and bishop, and so on. So in this stage, the players try to overwhelm each other, usually by crowning one of the pawns to a heavy piece, such as a queen. So, for example, I'll show you an example of end game. This is an example of endgame. The white will try to advance this position. The white will try to advance his pawn to the 8th row in order to do the crowning process and replace the pawn with a queen. And the black will try to prevent this process and also to make a mate on the white king. First of all, he will try to eat the white pawn and then to checkmate the white king. Okay? At that point, the threat in checkmate to the king is small, and therefore the king becomes an active tool protecting the pawns and supporting their process towards the 8th row. As I have already told you, the white king will support his pawn in order to advance it to the 8th row. Actually, this is a loose situation to the white. In this position, the white will lose the game. It is very trivial because the black can easily take the white's pawn and then he can mate or do checkmate to the white king. Okay? Because the end game requires precise play, many players carefully study common end game positions. Okay, so we finished to talk about the 3 stages of the game of chess, and now I will talk about special moves and situations in the game. First of all, I will start with an en passant rule. Okay. When a pawn makes 2 steps advance from its starting position, yes, when it makes 2 steps advance from its starting position, that is the 2nd row, and there is an opponent's pawn on square next to the destination square, yes, there is opponent's pawn next to the white pawn, then the opponent's pawn can capture it according to en passant rule. Moving to the square, the pawn passed over. So the black can eat that pawn like this. This can be done only on the terrain immediately following the opponent's pawn's 2 square advance. Otherwise, the right to do so is forfeited. So, when the white moves his pawn 2 squares forward, only then the black has the right to hit that pawn according to 1% rule, like this, diagonally. But if the black, instead of hitting this pawn, made another other move, then he actually forfeited to hit that pawn according to the 1% rule. So he will have no right to hit that pawn according to 1% rule, because you can do it immediately after the 2 square movement. Only immediately after the 2 squares movement you can implement the 1% rule. Otherwise, if you do other move, then you will lose your right to hit the pawn according to 1% rule. So only when your opponent moves 2 squares forward with his pawn, then immediately you can hit the pawn according to 1% rule. Otherwise, if you do another move, then you will lose your right to hit the pawn according to 1% rule. Okay. So we finished to talk about the 1% rule. Now I will talk about the castling. In the game of chess, the castling is a joint move of the king and the rook that is considered as one move and is carried out in 2 stages. In the first stage, the king moves 2 squares towards the rook, like that. And in the second stage, the rook is moved 1 square after its king, like this. So this is the small castling. And in the big castling, you do the same thing. You move, first of all, the king 2 squares towards the rook, and then you move the rook after the king. Okay? So there are 5 conditions that must be met in order to perform a castling. The first condition that must be met in order to do castling, is that the king and the rook didn't move at all from their starting squares. So only if you want to do, for example, the small castling, then you can do it only if the rook and the king didn't move at all from the beginning of the game. If the rook moved to h3 and then comes back to h1, then you actually lose your right to do small castling, but you can do the big castling. The same thing is if the white rook on a1 moves to a5 and then comes back to a1, you actually lose your right to do big castling, but you can do small castling. Okay? And if you move your king during the game and then return it back to the starting point, then it is impossible to make neither a big castling nor a small castling. Why? Because when you move your king, actually you lost your right to do castling. You cannot do neither the big castling nor a small castling. Okay, so the first condition is the king and the rook that the participants in the castling process didn't move at all from their starting squares. Okay, so that is the first condition that must be met in order to do castling. The second condition that must be met in order to do castling is that the king is not in a chess threat at that moment. I'll show you an example. In this position, the white king is in a threat of check by the black bishop. The black bishop threatens check on the white king. So in this position you are not allowed to do castling at all, neither a big castling nor a small castling. Why? Because when your king is in a check position, you are not allowed to do castling at all. Okay, so that is the second condition that must be met in order to do castling. The third condition is that the king will not be found in the threat of check at the end of the castling. In this position, you are not allowed to do neither a big castling nor a small castling. Why? Because after the small castling, your king will be in a check position by the black bishops. This is the reason that you are not allowed to do small castling. And you also are not allowed to do the big castling for the same reason. Because after the big castling, your king will be in a threat of check by the black pawn, by the black bishop. Okay, so in this position, it is not allowed to do neither a big castling nor a small castling. So that is the third condition, and the fourth condition is that the king doesn't move past a square threatened by the opponent's piece. In this position, if it is white's terrain, the white is not allowed to do small castling. Why? Because when he does the small castling, he must pass the square f1 that is threatened by the black bishop. So small castling is not allowed in this position, because your king must not pass through a threatened square during the castling. But you can do the big castling. Okay? Another example is in this position. You are not allowed to do the big castling from the same reason, because the king must pass through a threatened square by the black bishop. The black bishop threatens the square d1, and the king must pass through d1 in order to do the big castling. So big castling is not allowed in this position, but you can do the small castling. And the fifth and last condition that must be met in order to do the castling is that there are no tools that separate the king from the rook. In this position, you are not allowed to do small castling. Why? Because the knight, the white knight, separates between the king and the rook on h1. And in this position, it is impossible to make neither a big castling nor small castling. Why? Because you cannot do the small castling because of the knight that separates between the king and the rook on h1, and you are not allowed to do the big castling because of the bishop on c1 that separates between the king and the bishop on a1. Okay? If only one of the rook has been moved, it is still possible for the other rook to be used for castling. So if, for example, you moved the rook h1 to h4 and then you take it back to h1, you are not allowed to do the small castling, but you can do the big castling. Okay? If the square adjacent to the rook is threatened, it is not possible to make a small castling. So if the square adjacent to the rook, the square g1, is threatened by the black bishop, so first of all, actually you have two reasons why in this position we are not allowed to do the small castling. First of all, the square g1 is threatened by the black bishop. And after you do the small castling, then your your king will be in a threat of check by the black bishop. So according to condition number 3, you are not allowed to do a small castling, but you are allowed to do the big castling. Even if the rook itself is threatened and the conditions mentioned above are met, it is allowed to castle. In this position, the rook h1, the rook a1, this rook is threatened by the black bishop. Even though that the rook is threatened by the bishop, you are allowed to do the big castling. Okay? But in this position, you are not allowed to do the small castling, because after you do the small castling, your king will be in a threat of check by the black bishop. So according to condition number 3, you are not allowed to do small castling, and in this position, for example, even though that the white rook is threatened by the black bishop, you can do the small castling. Okay? But you are not allowed to do in this position. Actually, you can do both the small castling, and you also can do the big castling. Why you can do the big castling? Because there is no problem that the rook itself passes through a square that is threatened by the bishop. The problem is only with the king. The king must not pass through a square that is threatened by your opponent's piece during the castling. But the rook can pass through a square that is threatened by your opponent's tool. Okay? According to the 5th condition, according to the rule that I told you, that if your rook is threatened by your opponent's tool during the castling, and before the castling, you can do the castling, like this position. Yes? Even though that your rook is threatened by the black bishop, you can do the small castling. And here there is no problem at all that the white bishop passes through a square b1 that is threatened by the black bishop. So you can do both the big castling and also the small castling in this position. Of course, we assume that the white didn't move neither the rook on a1 nor the rook on h1 from the beginning of the game, and also he didn't move his king from the beginning of the game, because there is the condition 1 that must be met in order to do the castling. Actually, all 5 conditions must be met in order to do the castling. Okay. According to the rules of the game, to make a castling, the king must be moved first, and then the rook must be moved. So if you want to do castling, first of all you will move the king 2 squares forward the rook, and then the rook before the king, after the king. The same thing applies for the big castling. First of all, you will move the king 2 squares towards the rook a1, and then you move the rook after the king. Okay. Taking the rook before moving the king means a move where only the rook moves. So if you touch the rook, in this position, if you touch the rook, you cannot do castling at all. Neither big castling nor small castling. Because if you want to do castling, you must first of all move the king, and after that you will move the rook. If you first touch the rook, then you are not allowed to do castling at all. But you must move with a rook only. The same thing is if this rook, when you touch this rook before you touch the king, you are not allowed to do castling at all. Because in order to do castling, first of all you must move the king, and only after you move the king you can move the rook. Okay. The castling is an important move in the early stages of the game because it serves 2 important purposes. First of all, it moves the king to a more protected place than the center of the board where the battle started. Yes, in a small castling it moves the rook to a place that is more the king more protected, especially when you have also pawns that protects the king. The king in g1 is much more protected in relation to his position in the beginning of the game in e1. And also, if you do the big castling, then the king, especially if you have also the pawns that protects the king on c1 is much more protected than the king in e1 where he was from the start point. Okay, so the first aim of castling is to protect the king, and the second aim is to take the rook out of the corner and into a better attacking position in the center of the board. Yes, so in this position, after the white did big castling, the rook moved to the column D that is actually controls, the rook actually controls column D that is the center of the game, the center of the board. So you move the rook from the corner to a center column that controls the center of the board. The same thing is also if you do a small castling. The rook moved from the corner to more center, or the column F is close to the center of the board, and also the rook controls column F that is close to the center of the board. Okay. Okay, so we finished to talk about castling. The next topic that I will talk about is the decision. Check refers to the situation when one of the players attacks his opponent's king. So a situation of check, in this position, for example, the black bishop threatens the king in check. Yes. That is, the king stands in a situation where in the next move he will be taken if no action is taken. So theoretically this is a check position if, for example, the king, the white side will not react immediately to the threat of check, and if the white does an illegal move, theoretically the black can hit the white king like this. So that is the meaning of to threaten the king in a check. You threat in a check on the king, it means that if the king doesn't eliminate the threat of check, so in the next move he will be taken from the board. It is not allowed to do an illegal move, but it's theoretically to show you what is the meaning of the threat of check. on the king. So in a check position, the attack king side must cause the check position to stop in any possible way. So this is, in this position, this is a check position. The black bishop threatens check on the white king. So in this position, the white must eliminate the check immediately. The white must stop the check immediately. And you have actually three options that stop the threat. The first option is by eating the attacking piece. In this position, the black bishop on d5 threatens the king, the white king, so the white can eat the threatening piece, the attacking piece. And in this way, he actually stopped the check, eliminate the check. This is the first option that the white has in a check position. The second option is whether by blocking the path of the attack. In this position, the white can block the path of the attack by doing this move of pawn e2 goes to e4. So in this way, actually the white blocked the path of the attack, and of course it is a legal move. So this is the second option to stop the check attack, to stop the check. So, and the third option that the white has to eliminate the check, to stop the check, is actually to move the king to a square that it is not threatened by check. You can move the king to g3, you also can move the king to g4, you can move the king to f4, and you can move the king to e3. Okay? So, whenever your opponent threatens you in a check, you have actually three options. The first option is to eat the threatening piece. The second option is to block the path of the attack, or to block the line of the attack. And the third option is actually to move the king to a square that it is not threatened by check. Okay? But it must not be moved to the square that is being attacked. So, for example, I will explain you what I mean. In this position, the black threatens check on the white's king, so the white is not allowed to move his king to g3. Why? Because in g3 he is threatened by the black queen, and he also is not allowed to move the king to f4, because in f4 he also threatened by the black queen. Okay, so You are not allowed to move your king in a place that is attacked by your opponent's tool. If none of these actions are possible, the situation is called checkmate. A situation which the king cannot defend himself at all. So I will show you a situation of checkmate. So this position is a situation of checkmate. Why? Because the king, the white king, is threatened by check, and he cannot move his king to a square that it is not being attacked. He cannot eat the pawn e3 because the pawn e3 is protected by the pawn d4. He also cannot move to the square f4 because f4, in f4 he will be threatened by the queen, black queen, and he cannot move his king to e4 because in e4 he also be threatened by the black bishop on d5. So this position is a checkmate position. The black did mate, checkmate or mate to the white's king, and the black won the game. So checkmate occurs when there are three conditions that must be met in order to do checkmate and win the game. The first condition is that there is a threat to the king. In this position, condition number one is met because the black bishop threatens check on the white king. The second condition that must be met in order to perform checkmate is that the king cannot escape to any place that is not under threat. Okay, as you can see here, he cannot escape to any square that it is not under threat, as I've already showed you. And the third condition is there is no tool that can be protect the king. In this position, there is no tool that can protect the king from the check threat by the black bishop. The rooks cannot protect the king, and also the knight cannot protect the king, nor the pawns cannot protect the king, so it is a checkmate position. In relation to condition number one, that there is a check threat to the king, I will show you an example that when this condition actually must be met in order to make a checkmate on your opponent's king. In this position, for example, if it is white's turn, then it is a stalemate, it is a draw. Why? Because condition number 1 is not met. And all 3 conditions must be met in order to do checkmate and win the game, because of the fact that in this position, condition number 1 that says there is a threat to the king is not met, because in this situation there is no threat on the white king. So because of this fact, the black doesn't win the game, because in order to win the game all 3 conditions must be met, and the first condition, that there is a threat to the king, is not met. In this position there is no threat to the king, to the white king. So this is a draw position or stalemate. Okay, so if it is a situation that there is no threat on the king and the king cannot go to any square, then there is a draw, there is a stalemate, and no side won the game. So all conditions, all 3 conditions must be met. The 3 conditions are that 1, there is a threat to the king, 2, the king cannot escape to any place that is not under threat, and 3, that there is no tool that can protect the king. If one of these 3 conditions aren't met, then there is no checkmate, but as in this position it is a draw, it is stalemate. Whoever managed to checkmate won the game. Also, there are several rules that regulate the matter of check. The player must not make a move that is so that his king is threatened by check. So I have already showed you this situation. In this position, for example, the white king is not allowed to go to g2 because he is threatened by the black bishop, and also the white king is not allowed to go to h1 from the same reason. He is threatened by the black bishop. If the opposing player is not paying attention to the check and makes an illegal move, his king must not be hit and his attention must be drawn. So if the white does this move, illegal move, you must tell him that he made an illegal move, and the illegal move is cancelled, and the white must make another move in its place. So we cancel the illegal move and the white must make another move in its place. Okay? Now I will talk about 4 types of check. The first type of check is the direct check. Moving a piece so that it threatens the opponent's king by itself is called direct check. For example, in this position, if you move if it is black's turn and the black turns is the black moves his bishop from e4 to d3 and threatens check. This check is a direct check. Why? Because the tool that moves is the tool that threatens check on your opponents. So when the tool that moves is also the tool that threatens the check, this type of check is called direct check, like this check. Moving a piece so that it threatens the opponent's moving a piece so that it opens a line of attack for the piece standing behind it to face the opposing king is called indirect check. I will give you an example for indirect check. In this position, if it is black's turn, then he can move his bishop, for example, from d7 to f5, and by doing this move he actually made indirect check. Why? Because he moved the bishop and he threatens check by the rook on d8. So when you move piece, one piece and the other piece, by moving that piece, the piece that was behind the piece that you moved is the one that threatens the check, is indirect check. So when the check is not by the tool that you moved, but by the other tool, this check is called indirect check. So you moved the bishop, and by moving the bishop you created discovered check by the rook. This check is indirect check. Okay? And the third type of check is a double check. Moving a piece so that it itself threatens the opponent's king and at the same time opens a line of attack against the opponent's king for the piece standing behind it, that is a combination of direct check and indirect check in one move. It's called double check. So I will show you an example of double check. In this position, if it is black's turn, he can move his bishop from d7 to a4, and by moving his bishop to a4, actually he created a direct check by his bishop. So he created direct check by the tool that he moved, and he also created discovered check or indirect check by the black rook. So when you move one tool that it itself creates direct check, and also your opponent's exposed to indirect check, this type of check is called double check. Okay, I will give you another example of direct check. In this position, if it is white's turn, if it is black's turn, then he can move his bishop to the square c3, and actually he created a double check. He created a combination of direct check with his black bishop, and also he created indirect check with his queen. So this is another example of double check. Okay. A double check is exactly what it sounds like. A king is put in a check by two pieces with a single move. Double check almost always occurs with a discovered check or discovered attack. So, as you can see here, when the black moves his bishop to c3, created direct check by his black bishop, and also he created a discovered check by his queen. Okay, so it is a combination of direct check and discovered check or indirect check. This is the double check. Okay, and the last type of check, it is a cross check. There is also a type of check known as cross check, when a player responds to a king threat with counter check while blocking his opponent's check. So for example, I will show you an example of cross check. In this position, the black threatens check on the white king, and if the white king moves to d1, then it creates, from one side he escaped from the threat of check, and from the other side he also created counter attack on the white sorry, I made a mistake. Okay, so in this position, it is a check by the black rook, and if the white moves his king to d1, as from one side he escaped from the check of the black rook, and from the other side he created counter check by the white bishop. So when you escape from the check and create a counter check, this type of check is called cross check. Okay? So when you move the king to d1, from one side you escape from the check by the black rook, and from the other side you yourself create a check on the black king. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.